and we are looking now at live pictures coming in from Vatican City. What we're looking at is that procession today for moving the coffin, and there we can see it, of Pope Francis, the Pope who passed away on Monday. His coffin now being moved to St. Peter's Basilica. This is obviously a very somber moment for millions of Catholics around the world, and a very difficult moment for many who had gone to St. Peter's Square for the weekend for Easter celebrations and prayer processions, having seen the Pope on Sunday appear to the crowds. Many were hoping for a recovery, many were heartened to see him, and the news of his death coming as something of a surprise and a shock to many, particularly those there in the square as well as around the world. So we're watching the procession there to move the Pope's body to St. Peter's Basilica, where he will lie in state for 3 days, where the public will be allowed in to pay their last respects to a Pope who was remembered for his humility, for his concern for the poor, for his prayers for the peace, and for his stance on issues, sometimes controversial and decisive issues. Heads of state, of course, will be expected for the crescendo of the procession, which is Saturday when the funeral takes place in St. Peter's Square. Now, as we see the clergy there moving with the body of the Pope in the coffin, they'll be heading to a basilica which will be kept open until midnight on Wednesday, allowing the faithful to mourn, to come in and view the body. Cardinals also have some business to do, meeting at the Vatican on Tuesday to schedule Francis' funeral and burial plan, and obviously starting the process of the conclave to meet and elect his successor. I believe we now have with us our correspondent Jonah Hull. He's standing by for us at the Vatican City. And Jonah, we're seeing this procession. I think they just left the Pope's residence, right? Maybe you can talk us through the pictures we're seeing right now.
Well, they've just left the chapel of Santa Marta. Santa Marta is the small chapel that exists within the Vatican residence where Pope Francis himself lived. So it is a chapel that he would have used frequently to pray in. He has lain in it since Tuesday in an open coffin with dignitaries, including the Italian Prime Minister, the Italian President, I beg your pardon, coming to view the coffin, and residents of the Vatican itself. And of course, he's now being moved to the 16th century Basilica of St. Peter's. That's the enormous building you can see behind me that dominates St. Peter's Square. Where the funeral will take place on Saturday, but also where in a couple of hours' time his body will be placed on the altar, and after another service inside St. Peter's, the central doors will be open to the faithful, the Catholic faithful, who are already filling the square, waiting for the opportunity to file past Pope Francis's body and pay their final respects. They'll be able to do that till midnight on Wednesday and until midnight on Thursday, and then until 7 p.m. Procession makes its way. I'm just taking a look at the live picture being broadcast on the square. I see they're not actually moving at this moment, but the red-robed cardinals in attendance. The coffin, of course, watched over by the Swiss Guards. It's not going to be a long procession. It's a fairly short distance that they've got to cover from Santa Marta to St. Peter's through the Piazza of Santa Marta and the Bells Arch, out of view from us here on the square, but broadcast on a live screen for the faithful congregated here at the moment.
And just to clarify, Jonah, for our viewers, perhaps you can talk to us about the significance of St. Peter's Basilica, an important institution in church history, church tradition, not in the New Testament, but the writings of the fathers of the church associate this place with the burial of St. Peter, one of the apostles of Jesus, right?
Peter was one of Jesus' apostles, that's right. He travelled from Jerusalem to Rome, where he brought essentially the Catholic Church to Rome. He was considered by devout Catholics to have been the first pope. The seat in which the Pope sits, the chair that he occupies, is known as St. Peter's throne, St. Peter's chair. There's that seat now, of course, vacant after the death of the Pope. So yes, St. Peter's Basilica, a 16th century, immense and very impressive building, the centrepiece of St. Peter's Square, and this, of course, the heart of Catholicism, an immensely significant and important location. And it is meters away, of course, from where the Pope himself lives and spends most of his time, where most popes have been buried, and indeed where they've held their funerals, and indeed where most popes have been buried. This particular Pope, Pope Francis, of course, in a number of breaks with tradition in an effort to simplify and slim down the pomp, circumstance and ceremony around not just the papacy but particularly the papal funeral, decreed that he would not be buried inside the majestic grottos of St. Peter's. Instead, he will be buried 2 or 3 miles away from here in the Basilica of another church, Santa Maria Maggiore. It was very close to his heart, that he visited immediately after becoming Pope, to pray that he would visit every time he went on his travels from Rome. He would depart with prayers at Santa Maria Maggiore and immediately return to Santa Maria Maggiore, and inside Santa Maria Maggiore he will be interred on Saturday in what he has decreed will be a simple, unadorned tomb, but for the name Franciscus, his Latin name, of course, inscribed on top.
And in what you've mentioned there, I guess, Jonah, is really a sign of how even in death, Pope Francis continues to show his approach to how he approached the questions of tradition, what traditions he upheld, what traditions he reinterpreted, right?
It was probably the central theme of his papacy and his legacy, that he sought to, well, first of all, recognize that the church was becoming somewhat disconnected from many of its faithful, that it was no longer within reach or occurring at a level of the people, the faithful, the poor, the downtrodden, the marginalized, for whom, of course, the church was an original refuge. And Pope Francis sought to change all of that. He sought to pull away, to strip away the sort of majesty of the church and bring a humility to it. He chose the name Francis after St. Francis of Assisi, of course, who embodied all of those values and who worked in his lifetime for the poor, and that was the church that Francis wanted to build, a poor church for poor people, is what he said in his very first speech. So yes, he is noted here, and everybody you talk to here will tell you that he is noted for his embrace of the poor, also for his embrace of the environment, as St. Francis of Assisi did, and for streamlining, as I say, some of the doctrine, the rigid conservative traditionalist doctrine of the church. He didn't by any means change it entirely. No single pope could begin to do that. Well, begin he did. And one of the questions that will hove into view in the coming days as people start to debate the conclave that must begin in around 2 weeks' time to elect his successor is precisely that, whether where Francis began, his work can continue with a successor pope who is elected in order to do that, another reformer pope, or will there be machinations within the Vatican itself among the cardinals there, for some traditionalists and conservatives not entirely happy with the changes that Francis brought, for them to try and wrest the papacy back and start to undo, or rather not see any more done, to chipping away at the edifices of its conservatism.
And as we talk about the process going forward, as we watch the process happening now, do we have any indication, Jonah, and when might we get any indication of what, I don't want to say force, but faction maybe might dominate in the discussions going forward in the conclave to try and come up with a successor for the Pope, whether they are leaning towards the more reformist elements or the more traditional elements?
I mean, generally speaking, I'll be honest with you, if you ask that question now, people quite bluntly say it's too soon. We must focus our reflection on Francis himself. However, of course, that subject is very much being discussed behind the scenes. Essentially, the conclave will involve 138 so-called elector cardinals who were chosen and appointed the power of a vote in that conclave, that very secretive process that will take place in the Sistine Chapel. More than 2/3 of those elector cardinals were, in fact, elected by Francis. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of those will vote in the direction of a reformer pope, but it certainly lends some help in that direction. There is no sort of well, I mean, I suppose, of course, the key message is continuity, that the power invested in the papacy continues, passing from one pope to the next. We're witnessing the passing now, and all of the messaging from the Vatican over the coming days will involve meetings, successive meetings by cardinals behind closed doors to discuss the processes and the timing, not just of the funeral, which is the next big stage, but the conclave to elect his successor. In all of this, there is ritual, there is tradition, and there is an essential sense of continuity. I think that probably would be the central message. People watching, of course, all over the world, in countries on every continent, 1.4 billion strong, the Catholic congregation, not growing everywhere, it has to be said, growing in parts of Africa, growing in parts of Asia, somewhat stagnant across much of Europe, but nevertheless an enormous global congregation of this very important church, who are all watching, as I say, the passing of a Pope, Pope Francis, and in the immediacy of this very event now, his passing from within the sort of walls of the Vatican into a place where he will be essentially given back to the faithful inside the Basilica of St. Peter's, where over the next 3 days people will be able to go themselves and pay their final respects to a Pope who was really in many ways quite glamorized, a sort of rock star Pope. We've heard that said more than once before, and you saw that on Sunday, Easter Sunday, his final public appearance here, where he received an absolutely raucous rock star style welcome. He got that everywhere he went, to every country he visited. He was much loved, not just among the Catholic community and congregation, but outside Catholicism as well, because, of course, unlike many of his predecessors who held strongly to the great neutrality of this office, he would often break with that.
To the Basilica of St. Peter in Vatican City, there will be, we understand, a religious service, and all of this building up towards the funeral of the Pope on Saturday. No doubt we'll be bringing you more coverage of this as the day unfolds.